What's going on, guys? Today, I need to talk about an incredible piece of cinema. I recently finally had the opportunity to check out The Pacific from HBO's limited series. Came out quite a while ago now, going on, I think, about 14 years. Growing up as a kid, I had seen ads for this show and I had always heard bits and pieces about it. And for forever, I've been meaning to finally check it out, but I never really had the opportunity until recently. And I texted one of my good friends and asked if it was worth checking out. And he said, yes, absolute masterpiece. So without hesitation, I turned it on, and first and foremost, full spoiler warning for this show. And for the love of all that is holy, check out this show. It is worth your time, and it is incredible. I will warn you, it has the most realistic portrayals of combat that I've ever seen put to film, and there's a lot of really gnarly content. There's some crazy, crazy violence, and the show really, it honestly does a number on your mental capacity. So take time to get some exercise in and reflect on what this show shows. But we should not shy away from the content because this is all real. This show did its history, and it is extremely accurate in its portrayals of the Pacific Front during World War II. And for the sake of all those that suffered and died during this conflict, you need to watch this show to just pay your respects to them. And I'm going to be doing an in-depth analysis on why this show absolutely blew my mind and was an experience. So to give some context on the origins of this show, Stephen Ambrose wrote Band of Brothers, which was adapted into a very successful limited series on HBO around the year 2000, 2001. I mentioned it in a previous video, and since the book was documented very well and followed a single company of soldiers, it was a bit easier to put on the big screen and follow the characters. The Pacific Front of World War II was much more unforgiving and brutal in terms of combat. And this honestly shouldn't be a hot take, but in my opinion, without the Russian front and the Pacific Japanese front, the Asian front of World War II, World War II is frankly not that interesting. Everything that happens on the Western Front, after D-Day, it's all just descending towards victory after that. Sure, there's a bit of a toss-up with the Battle of the Bulge, but there was really no way that Hitler was going to win after D-Day. The Pacific Front and the Russian Front of World War II, those are completely different stories. And the combat that was inflicted in those regions is on another level of horrificness that the Western Front never experienced. So right off the bat, one of the main complaints that a lot of people have with the Pacific is that it's harder to keep track of the characters, especially when comparing it to Band of Brothers. But that makes sense, and it's because of how brutal the combat was on the Pacific Front. The casualties were horrendous, so it wasn't really feasible to find a group of guys that all knew each other before combat and made it to the end of it. They suffered so many casualties, so yeah, understandably, it's going to be a little harder to keep track of everyone because almost none of them survive. So the two main characters of the show follows is a Marine named Sledge, and another one named Lecky. At the start of the show really follows Lecky, and then it essentially pivots and hands the story off to Sledge because of what happened to Lecky. He was severely injured and was out of commission for the remainder of the war. And episode 1 does not wait around. It does not hold anything back. It shows the Marines getting ready to enter combat, and then by the end of the episode, your jaw is already on the floor after seeing the horrific combat that takes place at Guadalcanal. I think one of the components that really stood out during this episode is when their commissioned officer, their captain, loses his composure and understandably is not able to lead them during the combat when things escalate to 1,000. Who can blame him? My goodness, it's absolutely crazy what goes on. And then this continues on into the second episode with more harrowing combat scenes. But what I really appreciated is that the show took the little moments to show how it's not just the combat that made these Marines' lives hell on earth. It was the other components that often you might not think about. For instance, in this episode, it shows that their food has maggots in it. That was nasty. Oh, I can't even imagine. And this careful precision and paying attention to the little details continues throughout the show. In episode 4, there's a similar moment where one of the characters slips in the mud and gets disgusting bugs all over him. Just moments like that, or where they're dealing with the mud and the filth and all sorts of things that on paper you tend to just they're not brought to your attention, but this show does a brilliant job of portraying how every waking moment of these troops' lives was just a definition of tension, horrific anxiety, and traumatic experiences left and right constantly. So it's around the 5th episode that we're reintroduced to the character Sledge, who was unable to enter combat earlier in the war, and now he's finally arrived right when his good boyhood friend is about to leave the Pacific Theater. And seeing the gung-ho and eagerness for adventure that's in this guy, and seeing that get thrown out the window with the landing at Peleliu was a sight to behold. The carnage on the beach. Wow. Frankly, I think you could argue that Saving Private Ryan has nothing on the Pacific for brutality and horrifying levels of violence. And seeing how, as the show progressed, as the reins of the storytelling were handed over more to Sledge, and the way that his character began to succumb to the vices and barbarity amongst his fellow Marines was brilliantly portrayed and was frankly dishearteningly realistic. I thought that the way that Snafu was a foil for Sledge, showing what man becomes when he's left to himself and institutionalized into a factory of carnage. The way that they're collecting golden teeth off of their enemies, the way they talk about them, and my goodness, as the show progresses and you can see Sledge becoming like Snafu, it was masterfully portrayed, incredibly put together. And I found it interesting that when Sledge at one point is about to stoop down to his peers' levels and collect some golden teeth off of a dead enemy, that Snafu tells him not to. But he doesn't really... He struggles to find reasoning as to why they shouldn't, because he's been doing it for the last few episodes by now. We see Sledge become more hollow, and Snafu begins to counter him and actually becomes more human and more likable. I think that just really goes to show that there's always hope of redemption, but there's a guarantee of damnation if we do not stay vigilant and compose our behavior in a way that uplifts despite the madness that is around us. And that really struck a chord with me as I saw these performances, and it is some difficult content to see, but as I stated, this show did its research and almost everything is portrayed accurately to the T. And certainly by far the best action components of this show are in the final episodes with the fighting over Okinawa. A brutal battle, and my goodness, the interactions with the rare Japanese prisoners of war, I think that was really just symbolizes the amount of hatred that there was between the US and Japanese forces. They've called it war without mercy. The cultural divide and brutality was something that was had not been seen before in modern warfare. We haven't seen it since then, and it was not present on the Western Front. Looking at the casualties and the fact that Japanese troops fought to the bitter end, it really makes you wonder what would have happened if the United States and their allies had to invade the home islands of Japan. If on Okinawa, which was Japanese sovereign territory, if untold numbers of Japanese troops fought until they were all killed and took so many of the civilians with them, which the show did not hold anything back, showing that their lives were just in the crosshairs and crossfire. Really leaves a mark And frankly, by the end of this, I was without words to express what I was feeling. It was absolute crazy town. And the last episode, which showed these Marines returning home after they had been so profoundly shaken and scarred by all that they had endured. This show really, you gotta give it up to the Marines. And I can't imagine trying to return to life after all of that. Being utilized as basically cannon fodder. And understandably, if one were to live through all that, you'd seriously feel invincible. But my goodness, does it come at a tremendous toll on their mental health and ability to lead a life afterwards. And to conclude, I implore you to watch this show if you haven't. It's important that we never forget all the pain and suffering that was endured across the globe during World War II, but especially in Asia. It's something that can't afford to be overlooked. And it really leads me to reflect on how much armed conflict and subsequent agreements and interactions lead to a changing political landscape. Think about that. At the height of this conflict, these Marines had no idea when the war would end, if ever. And fast forward roughly 80 years, and the world is a much different place. The United States and Japan have overcome their differences, and now Japan is one of the greatest allies of the United States. If we turn to Europe, we have NATO. That said, most of those European countries aren't actively contributing to their defense, or barely any of them have met their goals of spending a certain amount of their GDP towards their defense, even though there's a full-blown war in Europe again. How ironic that the Western European nations that we fought tooth and nail for to save and liberate, all these years later, even though their sovereignty is potentially threatened again, they're not following through on commitments that they agreed to over 10 years ago. While Japan, our former enemy, has gone on to become one of our closest allies. Sorry for the side political tangent, but hey, that's what I always bring. And the Pacific gets an A.